Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The dawn crept over the village like a whispered vow, its light soft as a sigh, spilling through the mist to cradle the rice fields that swayed beyond the dike. Diep stood by a weathered gate, her hands clutching a bamboo basket, its strands frayed as her heart. The air was heavy with dew and wood smoke, laced with the cluck of chickens and the faint rush of a stream winding through the hills. Hockey, her small dog, pressed against her leg, his frame thin but warm, his eyes sharp with hunger, but even his nudge couldn't still the ache in her chest. The truth that she wasn't Tuan's sister, that her mother wasn't hers, had cut deep, but she'd chosen to love them, to call them family. Yesterday she'd stood with Tuan, her coins for her mother's care in his hands, her voice steady with forgiveness. Yet as the village stirred, she wondered if her love, like the persimmon she'd bought, could hold its sweetness against the weight of loss. She stepped onto the path, her sandals sinking into the earth, each footfall a thread to a past she'd rebuilt. The village was a patchwork of memory, palm roofs glinting under the sun, a market where voices haggled over greens, a stream that shimmered like scattered coins. She'd come here broken, a girl sold as a child, her name her only shield, until Tuan had found her, his voice trembling with a lie. "You're my sister," he'd said, and their mother had wept, her hands tracing the birthmark on Diep's neck, a guide to a family she'd clung to. They'd sat in a shack, weaving baskets by lamplight, the air thick with rice and forgiveness. "You're home," her mother had said, her cough a soft scar, and Diep had believed it, a spark against the dark she'd wandered. Her mother's hands had taught her to weave, each strand a lesson in patience, a map of love she'd carried through the years. She'd been a child then, barely 5, when an uncle had sold her, his coins heavy with betrayal. She'd lived with strangers, her name a secret, until she'd fled, a girl of 12, her heart a drumbeat against fear. Tuan had found her in a market, his eyes wide with a lie, and brought her to their mother, her cough already a shadow. "You're mine," she'd said, and Diep had wept, her hands learning rice, her heart learning home. But the truth had shattered that home, and now she stood, her love a choice, her pain a shadow that lingered, softened by her mother's smile, by Tuan's regret, by James's steady hand. Tuan's guilt had scarred him, his hands once empty, now steady with work, his eyes heavy with the pain he'd caused. "I'm sorry," he'd said, his voice low, and she'd nodded, her anger fading, her heart choosing family. She'd given him her coins, earned from selling black bulbs for chickens, 175,000 dong, wires included, to pay for their mother's care, and he'd taken them, his hands trembling, his voice soft with gratitude. "She's better," he'd said, driving her to the hospital, and she'd seen her mother's face, weak but warm, her hand soft against hers in the hospital's hum. "You're my daughter," she'd said, not knowing the lie, and Diep had promised to stay, to love, even as the truth lingered, a wound that pulsed but didn't break her. The stream glittered now, its waters catching the noon sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. Diep knelt beside it, her fingers trailing in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. She'd met James here, his truck mired in mud, her laughter shy as she helped him push. "I'm no city man," he'd said, his eyes warm as the soil, and she'd believed him, her heart opening before she knew his wealth. They'd worked the fields together, planting melons, dreaming of a farm where love grew deeper than roots. "This is ours," he'd told her, his voice steady as the hills, and she'd seen a house, a garden, a life woven from their hands. But his world was cracking now, companies pulling capital like threads from a tapestry, and she wondered if their dream could hold, if her love could anchor him as his had anchored her. Her past was a shadow woven into her steps. She'd been married once, a girl of 16, to a man who saw her as less, his hands heavy, his voice sharp. She'd fled, her name her only map, and built a life, a shack, a garden, a mother she'd chosen. James had seen her, not as broken but as whole, and she'd dared to dream with him, to plant more than crops, to grow a future. But the truth, Tuan's lie, her mother's love, had tested her, and the coins she earned, the bulbs she sold, were a tether to a family she held despite the lie. She'd stood in the market, her voice sharp with barter, selling bulbs to warm her chickens, and smiled, her heart heavy, knowing each coin was for her mother, for love. James had come to the village, his boots muddy, his face tight with worry. "John's company pulled out," he'd said, his voice low, and she'd listened, her basket heavy with feed, as he spoke of others, big and small, following suit. The wood empire he'd built, machines humming with Korean steel, Japanese precision, was teetering, its 200 tons a day at risk. He'd met Diep, a wholesaler from Tientsin, his voice steady as he pitched his 10 factories, their output steady, their future bright with 15 more planned. "We're the best," he'd said, his father's 25 years a shield, but Diep had balked, unwilling to wait months for new machines, his eyes sharp with doubt. "Others won't wait," he'd said, and James had nodded, his jaw tight, his dream of expansion a thread that could snap. The shack glowed now, its roof patched, its yard alive with the cluck of chickens and quails Diep tended. She knelt by their coop, her hands steady as she fixed a bulb, its black light a warmth for hatchlings James had sent. Hockey curled at her feet, his warmth a quiet balm, and she thought of her mother, her bed small in the hospital's hum, her cough softer but stubborn. "You're here," she'd said, her hand weak but warm, and Diep had nodded, her throat tight, giving Tuan her coins, promising to stay to love even as the truth lingered, a wound she'd chosen to bear. "Get well," she'd whispered, and her mother had smiled, not knowing the lie, her love a spark Diep wouldn't let die. Tuan had driven their mother to the hospital, his hands tight on the wheel, his voice soft with hope. "She's stronger," he'd said, and Diep had nodded, her money in his hands, her heart lighter but not free. She'd spoken to him, her voice steady, her anger gone. "You're my brother," she'd said, and he'd wept, his guilt a weight they shared. "I lied to protect her," he'd said, meaning their mother, and she'd nodded, choosing family, choosing love, even as her heart ached, the truth a scar that wouldn't fade. James had stood beside her, his presence a quiet strength, his voice a guide. "It's enough," he'd said, meaning her love, their bond, and she'd clung to it, a vow that held her still. The village carried on, its rhythm a gentle pulse, roosters crowing, a child's laughter fading into the dusk, the stream's murmur a constant hymn. Diep wandered to the market, its stalls alive with Tet's glow, persimmons ripe, there sent heavy coins changing hands for bulbs and fruit. She'd bought a bag, her fingers steady, her heart less so, and carried it to the hospital, her mother's smile a balm to her pain. James had taken her to the village games, the field alive with cheers, soccer balls flying, the score 5-0 for Kim Bin. "Forget the sadness," he'd said, buying water, 20,000 dong cold and sharp, and she'd nodded, her heart lifting, his laughter a song she wanted to keep. James had spoken of farms, of fields heavy with grain, of cattle and poultry under their care. "We'll build it," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her hands ready, her heart full but fragile. He'd managed his company, his voice sharp with orders, wood worth billions, machines to mend, partners to sway, and she'd listened, her heart torn between pride and fear. Diep had seen his machines, their size a marvel, their speed a promise, but his refusal to wait was a blow, a crack in James's world. "We're steady," James had said, his father's legacy a shield, but Diep had seen his eyes, the worry that lingered, the weight of a dream at risk. The chickens clucked now, their feathers bright in the dusk, and Diep scattered feed, her hands steady, her heart less so. James had sent them, a gift to ease her days, and she'd built their coop, her fingers sure, her mind less certain. The quails huddled, their mother close, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. Her mother lay stronger, her cough fading, her love for Diep a thread that held, blood or not. Tuan worked, his hands mending what broke, his heart mending what he'd torn, and James fought, his voice steady, his love a shield against her pain. Tet was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. She thought of James, his laughter, his hands on her arm, his voice a balm to her wound. He'd spoken of machines, of wood heavy with promise, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her mother's strength was new, a thread that could snap, and James's company, though steady, was a house of cards, its partners fleeting. The truth, "She's not yours," was a wound she carried, its edges softening but sharp, and the love she gave to a mother who wasn't, was a choice she made each day. She thought of the hospital, her mother's hand in hers, the coin she'd given Tuan, the promise she'd made, "I'll stay." James had stood beside her, his presence a quiet strength, and Tuan had watched, his eyes wet with gratitude, his voice soft with hope. "She's better," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart racing, her hands still from stroking her mother's hair. "You're mine," her mother had said, and Diep had believed it, wanted to believe it, Even as the truth cut deep, James had spoken of love, of bonds that held beyond blood, and she'd listened, her pain raw but easing, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The games had been loud, the field alive with cheers, the water cold in her hands. James had watched her, his eyes soft with pride, and she'd smiled, her heart heavy with doubt. Enough for him, for his world? She'd fed the chickens, built their coop, and thought of her mother, her love a spark she wouldn't let die. James had stayed, his boots by the door, his voice low with plans. "We'll build," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart trembling, her eyes on the fields, their green a hope she clung to. The truth was a wound, but his love was a balm, and she wanted to trust it, to believe it could save them. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would her mother heal or fade like the dusk? Would James hold his company, or falter under loss? Would their love, their farm, stand strong, or would pain, hers his worlds, pull them apart? She thought of the chickens, the quails warm, the love that held her mother close, and James's voice, "We're enough," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their dream shine, a seed in Tet's hope, or wither under truths too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now, Diep stood by the stream, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of his promise, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.